To explain the complexity of the situation, we're joined by Adam Isacson. He's a senior associate for regional security policy for Latino America here in Washington, D.C. He recently returned from Colombia. Welcome to the show, Adam.
Thank you for having me.
My first question to you is, what exactly are the farmers demanding, and why did the other groups join this protest?
Well, farmers in general in Colombia have been hit hard by a recent drop in commodity prices. Some of them are blaming it on their government's signing of free trade agreements with dozens of countries around the world lately. Fertilizer prices are up, a whole bunch of things like that. This has been a year of protests in Colombia. We've already seen coffee growers protesting earlier in the year. Earlier, peasants and cocoa growers protested in an area near the Venezuelan border with some violence, and now this. It's interesting, you're seeing folks in Colombia in the cities sort of rising up in solidarity with them because they do. And anybody who's sort of center or left of center in Colombia is blaming free trade and globalization for a lot of Colombia's ills. But the peasant protests are unique. They have stood down as soon as they got a guarantee of subsidies. But you've seen the protests in Brazil this year, the protests in Turkey this year, which were more sort of middle class, urban, educated folks, people who were kind of plugged into globalization anyway, using social media. This was not that. This was much more organic and coming from the countryside in several areas of the country.
Well, you mentioned free trade agreements. Do they have a point? Can this be fixed in any way? Do they have a valid reason to blame free trade agreements?
They probably do, although most of Colombia's free trade agreements are so new. They've barely begun being implemented. I don't even think they've really felt the impact of them yet. But certainly the prospect, if you're a rice farmer or a corn farmer, of seeing a flood of U.S. subsidized also, U.S. goods coming in that are much cheaper, you're going to go out of business. And free trade agreements have winners and losers, and the people that were blocking roads throughout the month of August are definitely on the losing end.
Some of the farmers and protesters have blamed the FARC, the guerrilla group, the FARC, in what they're angry about. Land reform has been a big issue between the FARC and the government. Do you think that the FARC could be in any way behind any of these protests?
Well, sure. There are people in Colombia's government and military who have gone out and said that these protesters are in league with the FARC. And that's an old trope that's been used against the peaceful left in Colombia to stigmatize them and to make them unpopular and make them seem like violent terrorists, even if they're just peacefully protesting. In this case, look, I mean, the FARC may be encouraging in some rural areas some of the peasants to join this, but this is not a FARC protest, not at all. If it was, they'd be having much more radical demands than subsidies. However, the FARC is interested. They're negotiating peace with the Colombian government right now. They're interested in, if they form an accord with the government, being a political party in the future. And to be a political party in the future, they need a base. They're not very popular on the whole in Colombia, but if they have a base, it's going to be these peasants. And so to see them perhaps, if they're encouraging this, they're actually preparing the ground for future political participation, which makes me optimistic about the talks.
Well, are they organized? Would they have even been able to pull off some of this?
In some areas, yes, but not in all of the areas around the country where we saw this happen. There was, in June, there were some actually quite violent protests in an area called Catatumbo near the Venezuelan border, where there's a lot of coca grown. There, the FARC may have played something of a stronger role just because they've been there longer. People in that area grew up with the FARC. But in Boyacá, where I think this picture was taken, or in Nariño in the mountains, they don't have the same roots, and they just wouldn't have had that organizational ability.
I want to ask you about the president, Juan Manuel Santos. First of all, his chances for re-election, but is he kind of playing it safe by not really making any bold statements surrounding these protests?
His reaction to the protests initially is probably the reason why that Gallup poll found his numbers dropping so quickly. He famously and unfortunately said there's no such thing as a rural peasant protest movement a few days into these protests, which Colombians found ridiculous because half the country's roads were being blocked by it at the time he said it. He seems sort of out of touch. He had to play catch up and send a lot of his ministers to go negotiate. And at that point, he did seem more in tune and more in touch, but I think the damage had been done. And it was sort of surprising to see so much of Colombian public opinion which is a pretty conservative country. Colombian public opinion suddenly sympathizing with a lot of these protesters and seeing their side of the story instead of Santos's. I think it's been about a week now since the agreement was reached to lift the protests. I think President Santos is working to turn the page there, and I bet if they took that poll right now, his numbers would be somewhat higher.
How about 2014?
Yeah, May of 2014 is a presidential election. Santos has already announced he's going to run again. Even during his best moments, he was polling in the high 40s, or maybe 50%. That may be enough to win, though. He's not incredibly well loved by Colombians, but there is general support for his peace process, and whenever it seems to have momentum, that support grows with the guerrillas. And there's really a lack of a viable opposition. The main opposition figure is actually the former president, Alvaro Uribe, a figure of the right wing in Colombia, who broke with Santos over several things, including the peace process. Uribe is constitutionally prohibited from running again. He served 2 terms already. And none of the people in his organization really are polling well, or even have a lot of name recognition. He has not surrounded himself with heavyweights. And there are no real other heavyweight, high name recognition people in Colombia who have sort of the ability to get out the vote and have a big political machine behind them who appear willing to run. So right now, for lack of an opponent, Santos is in good shape. I think you'd say the same thing about Dilma Rousseff in Brazil, who is not incredibly popular, but really lacks a viable opponent too next year.
All right, Adam Isacson, we appreciate your time. Thank you for your expertise. Thank you for joining us on the show.
I appreciate the invitation. Thank you.